What is going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I realize that this is the second week in a row that I've started things off with something unexpected, but I think there is a lot to love about Goon Knight right now. This deck, this exact configuration, at the time of recording, of decks with more than 100 games played in top 10% Infinite on Untapped, has the highest win rate in the entire game. 70+%. Now, granted, a lot of that is because the people that watch my videos are a little more plugged in, and so they can end up having higher stats than what a normal player would with the deck. But I think that this is enough for me to say that this is one of the better decks in the game. You should actually be prepared for it, and you should no longer be surprised when your opponent plays Fenris Wolf and snaps you on turn 2, because then they're about to play a Moon Knight, discard a Proxima, get back something on the Wolf, and you are going to lose. This deck is as you remember it being, with Fenris Wolf being a massive, massive addition. It makes your Moon Knight even more dangerous. And for more on this deck, we did just do a video, which I will have linked down in the comments. The deck is a deck that plays a mid-range game plan with a specific type of disruption aimed at the hand. One thing I really want to emphasize to you, though, because I have seen people in relatively high Infinite ranks make this mistake. Please, I am begging you, activate your Black Widow after you play Black Bolt. This is crucial. Otherwise, it's like neither of them did anything. That's the #1 biggest play tip I can give you when playing this deck, and I realize there are going to be people who are like, what are you talking about? Trust me. Just trust me, okay? Now, as far as budget replacements, I do think that this deck is fairly pricey as far as that goes. I don't think there's a reasonable budget replacement for Cassandra Nova, for example. I don't think there's a reasonable budget replacement for Fenris Wolf. But for Hydra Bob, I do think you could play Nico Minoru. People have been trying this deck with Swarm instead of Proxima Midnight. I'm not entirely sure that holds up, but it does maintain some of the same principles. It is a banner week for weird crap. I gotta be honest with you. This is the weirdest tier list I've ever put together, but these are my honest beliefs. Yes, we started with Goon Knight, and now we're going to talk about Ronan. Now, I will say, this deck has some issues that can show up when you are playing it. There aren't a lot of 2-drops you actually feel good playing, and that is just sort of a mental hurdle a lot of people find it hard to get over with this deck. Because yes, you tend to make it up on the back end with Anti-Venom and Malekith, but a lot of people are just not fans of not playing anything on turn 1 and turn 2. It feels weak, and people feel weak when it happens, and you get snapped, and you feel like the deck is unplayable. I will say, the real upside of this deck is not the Ronan stuff, that's whatever. What this deck actually is an anti-venom deck that is not losing to opposing loot cages. And I think that is a really important evolution in the metagame to point out. Anti-Venom is the mid-range card of the moment right now. Because of Anti-Venom, Luke Cage has a very high play rate. When you are building a Luke Cage deck with Anti-Venom in it, you automatically start to think, how do I make more things work with that Luke Cage? Right now, I consider that a trap. The reason is, everyone else in the metagame is thinking that too, and when your Luke Cage gets Luke Caged by your opponent, you just don't have cards that do anything. Your Ajax is 7 power. Your Hazmat didn't do anything. And that is the most dangerous thing about playing a Ajax Hazmat version of Anti-Venom, and it is why this build is stronger in my opinion. It is doing something of maybe less objective power, but much more relevant power to the metagame. This deck is not getting obliterated by the existence of Luke Cage. In fact, there's not a single tech card that shuts this deck down, and that matters a lot. This list, to me, has almost fully supplanted Serra Control as a concept. This is the deck that is doing the Serra Control role in the metagame right now. We're using Fenris Wolf, Shang-Chi in order to make sure that anyone who's going way too tall gets dragged down to earth, and we get a lot of benefit from that. This is a powerful list. I consider it one of the best in the game. Another pure mid-range anti-venom Malekith list that, again, is not over-indexed on Affliccan. The existence of decks like this in the Ronan deck is part of why over-indexing on Affliccan is bad. Because if you face these decks up side by side, the one that loses to Luke Cage is going to lose when you play each other. And this deck manages to not lose to opposing Luke Cages. It has a lot of relevant interaction in the form of Red Guardian, Shadow King, and Shang-Chi. It has a lot of power in the form of the ability to do things like Gladiator and Fenris Wolf, although the power is a little bit more suspect than the interaction. Interaction is top-notch, power is a little bit less in terms of that, but there are just so many solid cards in here. Malekith and Anti-Venom have formed a sort of duo in the metagame where you'll see a lot of them together because of the way in which they can complement each other and because of the size of Malekith. It's just a good, solid strategy for mid-range gamers, and I think it's one of the best in the game right now. Arishem is in a really interesting spot in the metagame. There's been a rise in inclusions of cards like Loki and Quinjet, and while I can't be sure about why this is happening, I do have my theories, and you're gonna hear them. The basic theory that I have right now is that there's such a high quality or quantity, or both really, of anti-venom Luke Cage decks, and against those decks, you are actually very happy to play cards like Loki and try to go over the top of them and just do too much for them to actually catch up, take advantage of the fact that they're not playing a lot of good cards in the early game, get very ahead, play an Alioth, beat the crap out of them. Arishem right now is in a sort of mid-range killer mode. That's what it's trying to be. And a lot of the mid-range decks are going to be able to play you close, quite frankly. They're going to have the ability to deal with a lot of what you're doing. They're playing Shadow Kings, they're playing Shang-Chi's, they're Fenris Wolf stuff. You are not untouchable here. But your ability to high roll is genuinely unmatched. And you can meet a mid-range deck on its own terms and just outpower them brute force with your energy. And I think that's why we're seeing more Quinjets. That's why we're seeing more Lokis. Loki is better the more mid-rangey stuff is in the meta. And Arishem trying to exploit those sort of ability to cheat right now, it hasn't been the most relevant thing. But this kind of metagame is sort of very lacking in combo decks, very lacking in things going very far over the top. And so you end up being sort of the largest predator around when you play Arishem. You're not always the largest predator around, but like there aren't a lot of people playing bounce. There aren't a lot of people playing move bounce. Those are decks you have to be really scared of, by the way. But you can scam your way out of your bad matchups, which I think is also the real upside to Arishem. It has a metagame role, and that is a mid-range killer, but it also has the ability to just sort of randomly win other games as well. There's been some mild innovation in the Scream space recently, so we're going to look at two different directions for Scream decks to go. The first is taking a little bit of a page out of being surprising out of Arishem's book here. There are just very few ways to play around the stuff this deck can do. And as someone who's lost multiple 8-cubers to constantly playing around Magneto, the fact that this deck has the threat of Magneto without actually needing Magneto is extremely, extremely dangerous because you never know exactly what your opponent is running. On that subject, a lot of people get upset when they talk about Arishem and like all of the ways it can randomly generate stuff. But I will tell you something I find nearly as frustrating, if not more frustrating, is decks like this just switching around their 6-drop every week. It's so hard to know what the hell you're actually supposed to play around. Is it Heimdall? Is it Arishem? Is it Alioth? Is it Magneto? I don't know. Obviously, it's not Arishem, but we're going to ignore that because I misspoke, and I'm probably not going to edit that out. Now, you can understand, I understand why people get so angry at Arishem, but this kind of stuff is much more frustrating to me because it's a much more direct punish for trying to leverage your knowledge. Oh, most of these decks run Magneto? Well, I'm not, so punish you. And you have no real way of knowing whether or not that's going to happen. And frankly, I find that just as frustrating when it comes to playing against a deck like this as I do any kind of Arishem random generation. I can't think of a good reason why either of the bounce decks are not major players in this metagame. I can tell you that objectively, they're not. And I think that means that people are underplaying them or maybe playing them incorrectly. I think both move bounce and normal bounce are very reasonable and very strong contenders in this game. I do think move bounce is a hyper complex deck that I often have struggles with, even, and I'm like ostensibly pretty good, right? As I'm writing this or speaking this, I should say, I'm like ranked 28 in the world, and I struggle with this pretty hard, honestly. And that is meaningful. It's a hard deck to play. Even if you're quite good at the game, there are a lot of intricacies to it that I think make it unappealing. But I think if you master this deck, it could very easily be the best deck in the game. And I think that there is such a gap between actually knowing what you're doing with this deck and not knowing what you're doing with this deck. And so many skills and pieces of understanding that are hyper specific to this deck that I do think there is something to be said for this deck being vastly underrated at the top end. I think on most of the rest of ladder, it might not be worth it. It's just like you'd rather play something that curves out. I get it. That makes perfect sense to me. But I do think that there is something to be said for this deck in terms of having a very overpowering end game and the ability to do a ton of damage when you do it. This is a deck that has almost unparalleled point potential, and that is incredibly valuable in a mid-range metagame. Normal bounce is sort of building the same way. Normal bounce is basically saying, all right, I don't go as big as the high rolls from a move bounce deck, but I will much more consistently get point output that other decks cannot beat. I think normal bounce might almost be a little bit more underrated than move bounce in terms of at least metagame positioning, because there are a lot of decks. Like if I'm playing this and I queue into Arishem, I'm pretty sure I'm just winning. Like that's just a really strong matchup. And yeah, you know, sometimes you might get BS'd out of it, but having the ability to like bully snap decks like that, that's meaningful. It matters. What I'm less sure about is how it matches up into the other mid-range decks. One note here is that it actually is quite solid into the Goon Knight deck, in that you are basically playing very few cards that are actually going to be hit by your opponent's Moon Knight. You've got like Black Swan and like US Agent, like that's, or Agent Venom, and that's like it. Basically, you might get a Falcon pulled out of there. You're not really giving them much to work with when they Goon Knight you off that Fenris. It's really not all that much, and there are going to be hands where you are totally able to play around a potential for a Moon Knight because so much of this deck is 1s and 3s. And that is an interesting matchup too, because you have so much point potential that frankly, unless their disruption is incredibly meaningful, you're going to win every time. And I think part of what's allowing Goon Knight to succeed is that there aren't enough people playing this. There aren't enough people playing Move Bounce. This is a deck that has almost unrivaled point potential at a very consistent level. It's very strong, and I think people should be looking much harder at it. We talked about Scream decks earlier, but I do think that Small Ball Scream still bears a real mention. This is a deck that saw a lot of play after we included it in our last video, and then started falling off as people, not because it was actually bad. I think if you still look at it, it's got like 500 games, top 10% infinite, and like about a 55% win rate, which is really not bad for that kind of sample size. But I think people have just been exploring other spaces since the release of Fenris Wolf. This is a straight up solid deck. It has a lot of ability to leverage priority. It plays a powerful mid-range game. And honestly, the only knock on it is that it is not an anti-venom deck. And I think fundamentally, Scream has often been in a position where it has to scrape and claw to get towards good matchups against mid-range decks that just cheat, right? Like, Scream was always a deck where it's like the third best mid-range deck because the best mid-range deck is just doing something that cheats energy too hard for you to keep up with. So you always have to scam it out. That remains true here. This is still a deck that needs a lot from you, but I do think it has basically every tool you could ever want in order to win games in Marvel Snap. Normal Move has finally sort of solidified what goes in those slots that were removed when we had, you know, the War Machine Legion combo. Now we have Craven, we have Cloak, we have this stuff. It's fine. It's not as good as when we had War Machine Legion. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it is. But it has sort of coalesced on an actual 12 card consistent looking archetype. And that is what this is. This is the deck you remember it being. It is a powerful, dangerous, and very hard to play deck that is very good at invalidating final turn interaction. Because of Fenris Wolf, there is a lot of Shang-Chi and Shadow King right now. And that means that a deck like this is quite well positioned if it draws right. That's always been the problem with these decks, is the delta between their bad draws and their good draws is very large. And that is a problematic feeling for a lot of people because they'll pick up a deck, they'll play it, they'll get unlucky for 6 games, they'll go into my comments and tell me it's my fault. Which it is. I gave them the deck. It's 100% my fault. You are logically in the right for yelling at me every single time. Now, I also rig your RNG against you. You should remember that as well. The thing about this deck is it is the best deck in the game at handling those turn 6 interactive plays, which means it has a real niche right now. Movable Cosmo, Eliath, extremely powerful. The deck is a little finicky. It does take a little bit of work to make it happen, but it is very, very strong. Hit-Moonkey is in a similar space as Bounce. If you draw well, it can beat almost anything in the game, but I felt as I played it, it was like 3 points off every game I played, basically. It is so close, and there are so many reads you have to make and guesses as to final turns. So the better you are at reading your opponent, understanding what they're going to play, leveraging that skill on your final turn, the better off you're going to be playing this deck. I think it is a very valid contender for like, what are we looking for? And we're looking for like the best turn 6 deck in the game. There are several options for turn 6 decks right now. This is absolutely one of them. It is very, very functional, very fair, I would say, for a turn 6 deck, but it is still a deck that can get massive power output in unpredictable ways, and it is the kind of thing that will be vulnerable to some things, not as vulnerable to others. You can get Juggernauted, for example. That can be pretty tough. You can get, like Cosmode. Sometimes that's a problem if you're relying on the Hit-Moonkey. It's really more about the fact that your opponent doesn't really know your range. Your range is so very large with this deck. They always have to be afraid of like She-Hulk, Hit-Moonkey, Hit-Moonkey, like a bunch of free ones because of the Black Swan. You have extra energy, like all that stuff. This deck is very good at making that happen, but ultimately I feel like it's just a few points short of few too many games. Thanos is just very difficult to talk about. I do think at this point that I'm more convinced by normal Arishem than I am by Thanos. I think Thanos is like, it's fun that it works, but it's not like, oh my god, this is the best thing ever. It's pretty cool. I got nothing against Thanos. It's a very solid functional deck, but I do think that ultimately Thanos is basically just throwing your hands up in the air and saying, look, I'm going to do something unfair, and I'm going to bully you if you're a mid-range deck. And if you want to play a fair game of Marvel Snap, sucks to be you. You queued into me. We're not playing fair today. If I get lucky, you're out of here. If I get even moderately lucky, you're out of here. I don't even need like high percentile luck in order to beat a mid-range deck with this. It's just pretty favored because of the way the cards Thanos and Arishem and, Wave tend to work. Quicksilver Wiccan has taken, in my opinion, a backseat to many other mid-range strategies. I have found more success doing Anti-Venom and Luke Cage, but there are still Knights of the Quicksilver Wiccan out there. This is a deck that I consider potentially a little bit outdated, but it is still perfectly functional. A perfectly cromulent deck that is able to play a classic let's put points on the board mid-range style game plan that allows you to have access to Wiccan, to have access to powerful tools like Surtur. I do think that ultimately it starts running into the fact that there are other mid-range decks that may be able to high roll harder, but there is something to be said for the relative consistency of this. It's not the most consistent mid-range deck in the world, but when you're not hitting Wiccan, you still have a very coherent and functional plan. Whereas when Anti-Venom decks are not hitting Anti-Venom and Malekith, they end up having to sort of scramble and figure it out. Not that they can't, but it is a reasonable point to make. Weirdly, I see more people playing this list than the previous, and I'm very weirded out by that. This feels like the worst of all possible worlds. If I wanted to be playing a Wiccan deck, I'd rather not play the one that loses to opposing Luke Cage. If I wanted to be playing an Ajax deck, I'd rather play the one that has Anti-Venom in it and rewards me for playing my Luke Cage. This feels like going the opposite direction of the correct thing for both of them, but I do think I see way more of this than I do of the other build right now. And that might be like indicative of Wiccan. It might be indicative of people who don't own Anti-Venom. I don't exactly know. Maybe we can get Anti-Venom in here. Probably worth it at this point, right? Like, I am not overly convinced by all of the decision making here. But if, we put an Anti-Venom in here, maybe we can maybe you can talk to me later. I don't know. It just sort of feels like it's the wrong engine matched with the wrong points package right now. It's not bad. This deck is obviously still good. It's just I think you can probably do what it's doing in a better form. Husky Pile is low-key crushing it right now. One of the strongest decks on Untapped with more than 100 games played in the infinite top 10% bubble. This is the Husky Pile deck, but instead of using either Lady Deathstrike or Shang-Chi, there is now a Black Swan inclusion, which gives you more explosive power on the final turn of the game. I think a lot of people get this deck wrong. This deck is not actually like a mid-range deck or really anything like that. What this deck is actually honestly closer to like the existence of Bounce, the existence of Moon Girl. It's more like that. It's a deck that is looking to play for massive point ceiling and hopefully do so in a way that provides it immunity from interaction that you have available to you. Now, that means multiple things, right? That means that sometimes this is a deck that is playing Goliath on the final turn. That also means that sometimes this is a deck that is losing priority and playing like a bunch of 1-drops and an Infinite on the final turn. There's a lot of different directions this deck can go, but fundamentally, the package it's being built around is strong, is powerful, does work, and plays for very large points in a metagame that is so mid-rangey that sometimes they just can't deal with it. This honestly has to be the longest I've gone talking about good decks. Normally, like 5 or 6 decks in, it's like, okay, at that point, we're like, all right, other decks are probably going to do this stuff better. All of these decks are good. This deck is still good. There's so many good decks right now. It's actually just incredible how many good decks there are. I will tell you, I have one gripe with Surtur right now. It's not necessarily bad or anything even close to that. It's that I feel like I need 3 1-drops in order to play Cull Obsidian. But if I play that third 1-drop, I have to cut either Luke Cage, Juggernaut, or Cosmo, and I hate doing that. It's not as horrible to cut Luke Cage now, but like maybe a week ago, it was absolutely awful to do that because so many people were playing the flavors of mid-range that were all about stuff that died to Luke Cage. Now, it's a little less bad. There are plenty of other flavors of mid-range. Goon Knight, of course, picking up. We talked about the dynamic with other mid-range decks, moving away from Affliction in order to deal with the Affliction decks, right? The less you invested you are in Affliction, the better you are when both of you have Luke Cage. That means that it feels okay to cut Luke Cage from this, but it is definitely something to keep an eye on. There are several versions of Thanos running around right now. I've seen most commonly the Zoo and Surtur versions, but because we already talked about Surtur, I'm going to put the Zoo Thanos one on here. Thanos Zoo is a straightforward and powerful deck. I want to say B-Back was like in top 5 with it. I'm not positive. I do think so, but I'm trying to remember the exact name of a Korean player right now who is doing very well with a list looking a lot like this. This is a straightforward and powerful Thanos deck, and I do think it bears mention because we haven't talked a lot about Thanos outside of Thanos that Thanos is actually still good on his own. There are plenty of good Surtur decks with him. There are plenty of good Zoo decks with him. I've seen some Destroy decks with him. I have a fairly low opinion of those, but all of these decks have the same upside. When Thanos gets its good draws, you get a massively augmented base Zoo plan. When Thanos gets its bad draws, you actually mostly still get to be a Zoo deck, right? Thanos' bad draws are you not getting stones, but this deck, whenever you don't get stones, you get like a pretty much a reasonable Zoo curve. And I think that's a really nice like little deck building addition here, where we've ignored almost entirely like, hey, we're going to be like a Zoo, we're going to be like a Thanos deck. We don't really care. It's just about the numbers that we can put on the board. We can be a Thanos deck, we can be a Zoo deck. Best case scenario, we're both. Worst case scenario, we're still a pretty good Zoo deck. This is honestly bonkers because I think this might be the first tier list where I think every single deck we've talked about is like a 50+% win rate deck. All of them. None of them am I worried about. This is a good to great deck, honestly. I think that discard is a little bit overrated. I haven't really figured out why. I think people are way higher on it than is necessary. But also, it's a pretty good deck to play if people are going to start picking up Goon Knight, right? Like, this is the anti-Goon Knight. Never Goon against this deck. You will get got by Apocalypse. The deck is quite powerful. It is a straightforward points package deck. And frankly, if you're looking for something to go over the top of like Arishem stuff, of mid-range stuff, this deck can and will do that. Honestly, I would say that the biggest weakness this deck has is a fairly crippling ability to lose to Red Guardians on Draculas. That's just hard to deal with, and there are a pretty fair number of Red Guardians in those mid-range decks that you would otherwise not be worried about at all. This deck outputs points very well and very consistently. I would group it in almost the bounce category of this is what this deck is trying to be. It's trying to be a like final turn, turn 6 explosion of points deck, and it does that very, very well. Oh, also, you don't need Malekith to play this. Just put like another card that says discard on it in there. You will be fine. This was a genuinely bonkers tier list. Going through all of these decks really reinforced to me just how open the metagame really is. But it also reinforced to me just how expensive the metagame really is. Like, if you go back through those decks, a lot of the things that are being built around are cards that came out in the last 3 months. You're seeing a lot of Scream, you're seeing some Madam Web, you're seeing some Anti-Venom, you're seeing some Malekith. There's a bunch of Fenris Wolf stuff. Thanos just got buffed. Arishem, a lot of Hydra Bobs in these decks. I am struck by that because to me, objectively, this is a very diverse metagame with a lot of powerful stuff in it. But also, if you're missing that stuff, I feel like it's getting harder and harder to actually seriously compete. And I worry about that because this is a video series that I do to give you the insight onto like what the best decks in the game are. I don't really have any control over, whether or not you have the ability to play them. I've always thought that my goal should be provide the decks, and if people want to watch it, that's good. If they don't want to watch it, I wish I could help them, but I don't think I can, because in order to be intellectually honest about this, I have to give you my actual opinions about what the best decks in the game are, and that has to be agnostic of collection criteria, because that's how this works. And I am really struck by, like, yes, to me, very diverse, fascinating metagame, to a lot of people might not even be close to accessible. And I worry about that. There's just a lot of really pricey stuff that's really good right now. And I think that can really engender some negative feelings in people. And I don't really like being responsible for that, basically. What I'm really trying to say is go yell at somebody who isn't me. I agree your concerns are valid, but it's not my fault. I didn't do this. So, as always, thank you so much for making it through the video. I've been KM Best. I hope you can't tell I recorded this after like a 7-hour stream at like 5 in the morning. I really hope you can't tell, but I'm kind of afraid you can. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. Remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.